Hello, I'm Ahmed Elbaz. We welcome you to the first episode of the BIEN podcast about everything about the UBI, about the universal basic income. Today, for the first episode, we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Guy Standing from South University of London. And he's one of the founders of BIEN, and I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself first.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I wish the series every success. I became interested in basic income in the 1970s when I was doing my PhD in economics at the University of Cambridge. And with a group of like-minded economists and philosophers, we were exchanging letters and telegrams and phone calls around Europe. And we had a meeting in Louvain-la-Neuve where a group of us decided one evening that we would set up a network to continue discussions on basic income and discuss ideas and approaches and how we could legitimize it. And I came up with the acronym, the name of our network, BIEN, French, well, good ring to it. And it was Basic Income European Network at that stage. And we established the network, and I think most of us thought at the time that we would be exchanging information, occasional meetings, but it wouldn't last very long. And here we are in 2023, when BIEN has changed from its European network. It is still BIEN, but the E has become Earth. And that is because by 2004, at our Barcelona Congress of BIEN, we decided to change the name because so many people from around the world, including Egypt, yourself, and from people in every continent, were joining and expressing interest. And since then, we have continued to grow, and we're about to have our 23rd International Congress in Seoul, second time in South Korea, actually. Now, myself, I was not only co-founder, but for 22 years, chair or co-chair, because we always wanted to have two chairs, one man. And now, since our Dublin conference, our Congress, I have become an honorary co-president. And I'm delighted with the people who are now running BIEN. I think they're doing a fantastic job, led by Sarath Dabala, with whom I worked on a major pilot, basic income pilot in India, in Madhya Pradesh, where we provided 6,000 men, women, and children with a basic income and monitored through a moderated randomized controlled trial with 6,000 others who were not receiving the basic income. And I'm glad to say that today we are seeing across the world an increasing interest and support for a basic income and moving in the direction of a basic income. And I've taken that into my academic career. I worked for many years in the United Nations, in the International Labour Organization. And from my very earliest years, I realized that the old welfare state was not suitable for the modern form of capitalism that has been evolving since the 1970s. And it was that interest in the failings of the welfare state to respond to the new realities of globalized rentier capitalism that led to me being convinced that we had to move towards a basic income.
Thank you very much for that very detailed introduction. I think that a lot of our listeners for the first episode, it will be probably the first time for them to hear about the idea of an universal basic income, or at least hear in detail about it for the first time. So, and I know that right now there are a lot of different interpretations of how a universal basic income should be like. So I would like to ask you, in BIEN, we have like our own definition for an universal basic income. Would you like to explain it to the viewers?
Yes, a basic income would be an individual, modest payment made to every adult individually, men and women equally, with supplements for people with extra costs of living, particularly with disabilities. And it would be unconditional in any sense of contributions in the past or any behavioral forms required for entitlement. It would be paid monthly or at a modest interval agreed by the state, would be paid by the state. And there are various forms of how it can be afforded. We can come back to that later. And it would be essentially justifiable as a form of justice, a form of common justice. If we accept that we allow for private inheritance of private wealth, which every country does, it's the unearned income that is given down through generations, then think of a basic income as a common dividend on the common public wealth that we inherit, and be humble enough to recognize that our income is determined far more by the contributions of the many generations in our societies before us. And we don't know whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on contributed more or less. So in a sense, the basic income is a matter of common justice. And I think that that has been my hallmark throughout the time. It also enhances freedom and provides basic security, which is a public good and a need, a human need. And that justification, I think, is understood by more and more people. And you would have to have rules, pragmatic rules, by saying that a migrant to your society would have to wait for a certain period, perhaps 2 years, before they would become entitled to a basic income. It would be paid to citizens who are usual residents and legal migrants who have been in the country. That doesn't mean they shouldn't get any help from the day they move in as a refugee or as a migrant. Of course, they should receive help, but that should be outside the basic income. And this approach is much, much better than targeting on the poor, where you have to identify the poor, you have to measure who is poor, who is not poor, then you have to decide on who's deserving poor and who is not deserving poor. All of those forms of means testing and targeting fail. They have high exclusion errors, and then they create poverty traps. Because if somebody tries to move from being poor to non-poor, they lose the means-tested targeted benefits, and that's a disincentive for them to be active and to try and raise their living standards. That is ridiculous. Basic income is a paid entitlement, an economic right, and then you would be taxed on the earned income from first dollar or the first whatever it would be.
Also, just to be clear, because like there are like two, I know that there is like support for universal basic income from the rather leftist and from the rather rightist economic milieu, and a lot of the rather right people who support the UBI see that the UBI should completely replace the welfare state, like also replace like free healthcare and free education. What is your opinion about that?
I think that perspective is ridiculous. I think it has very little chance of ever coming into reality, thank goodness. And I believe that if we are strong enough to obtain a basic income system we will be strong enough to defend public social services, public education, public medical services. I strongly believe in nationalized health services and good public services. But we have to be sensible in realizing that everybody has a need to survive. And you can't survive unless you've got a basic economic security with which to buy your own food and clothes and pay your rent or whatever it might be. The two of services and basic income are complementary. I don't believe that all forms of social services should be provided by the state for free. I think some price mechanism makes sense in certain cases. In the case of health, I believe that health services should be provided through taxation, through the public service. With medicines, it pays to have a subsidized version because otherwise people don't take it seriously, buy to obtain medicines and throw it away and so on. So I think the price mechanism is needed in certain types of service, the same with water service. If you don't have it to pay anything, you tend to leave taps on or whatever it is, become wasteful. And we need to be careful about those things. But a basic income enables us to use the price mechanism sensibly and enables people who have low incomes to be able to obtain those services and pay for medicines or whatever it might be. And for me, this is an essential rebuilding of the social state that we're talking about. We're talking about giving an anchor of security, an anchor as in a boat's anchor, and for the services and the rest above that to be built through democratic means. So that for me is the position that we should adopt.
So I know that when we talk now about an universal basic income, we don't have in the basic definition a certain number, but because I think a lot of our listeners don't know what number to imagine. So for example, for a country like the UK, what would be your proposal for a decent amount of UBI to start with?
Well, I always answer that question by saying the first and most important thing that we should be working towards is having a system of social protection where we're moving in the right direction. We're moving in the direction of building a multi-level, multi-layered form of social protection in which a decent basic income would be the anchor, the base. And in that regard, I don't have a figure in mind that I regard as perfect, optimum amount. I would like it to be very high, but I know from political pragmatism that we have to build it slowly. We have to move in the direction. I believe, for example, that we should be setting up commons capital funds, something I've advocated in my recent books on the commons, where we have levies on those who take from our commons and make profit from our commons, put into the fund, and as that fund invests and builds up, it can pay out dividends along the lines of the Alaska Permanent Fund or along the lines of the Norwegian oil fund, which is built up through royalties from, in their case, oil and gas, but it can be from many other forms of taking from the commons, as I've described it in my books. Now, as that fund builds, the level that can be paid out would grow. I believe that if it was in Britain, for example, we are doing a pilot in Wales. And at the moment, each recipient is getting £400 a week. That is a good basic income, a very good basic income. If it were scaled up to a national level basic income system at the moment, I would expect it to be well below £400. I would be saying, let's start with £100. But that's not my target, because £100 would not give enough to have a decent standard of living. So you would, as the funds became available, you would build up that amount. And I think it's stupid for critics to say, Standing says £400. You multiply that by the number of people in the country, and you get a figure that a huge percentage of GDP. Impossible. That's their line of attack. It ignores the fact that every state pays out in subsidies and tax breaks vast amounts, billions of pounds or euros or whatever, in subsidies that go to the wealthy and to rich corporations. We would phase those out and put them into the fund and be able to pay a basic income without raising income tax. That's the important line. You do not need to raise income tax to pay for a basic income. There are other ways of doing it which would be consistent with a good functioning market economy. But it would be transformational because it would empower people, it would give people a sense of security, enable them to do different types of work, etc. So it would be transformational, but in a new context. And for me, an ideal level is something that we can imagine, but we shouldn't be trapped by it, because it's a matter of moving in the direction we want to go.
So next, I believe that an UBI would have a great benefit for humanity. But when I talk with a lot of my friends about UBI, they're often skeptic, and they always ask the same questions. And I would like to tell you the questions they always ask. So we can make it clear to them, how to respond to that criticism. The first one, which you hear a lot, why give everyone money if you could give those who need the money all the money they need? Why also give the rich money or so? That's the first question, which I hear a lot.
First of all, it's much more efficient for the state to give everybody a basic income and tax back from the wealthy or the higher income groups than trying to identify who is poor and, as I said earlier, use means testing, go and ask questions, go and ask about their assets, go and ask about different sources of income. And then you get to tests and all sorts of intrusive, administratively costly schemes. We know when countries do that, as many countries have done, the result is what we call a very high exclusion error. And what that means is a high percentage of those people in real need do not get anything. And at the same time, there are high inclusion errors. In other words, some people are able to tell lies and get away with it and get the money, whereas many of the poorest aren't able to, and they're frightened or whatever. It's much easier to provide everybody with a basic income and then say, okay, we're going to increase taxes on consumption or wealth or intrusion in the commons, whatever it might be. It's much more effective to do it that way around. And it's not a matter of saying giving the wealthy. At the moment, the wealthy are given a lot, and there is no basic income. So it's a matter of saying, let's make our taxation system more efficient and more progressive. That's the way forward. But give as an economic right everybody, you will find it reduces inequality much more effectively than targeting on the poor. There's a paradox. There's a real paradox. But as my books and others have shown, that paradox is being proven again and again and again. It's better to give everybody a basic income and tax back than try to identify the poor. And you don't have a poverty trap which is one of the worst features of those who say, why not just give to the poor? Because anybody who tries to become non-poor would lose more than they gain. That's crazy, crazy.
So I guess like the poverty trap is also the answer for the second question. And could you please say in more detail? It's because like the second argument, which I hear a lot about, often against UBI, is if we give everyone money, they would just stop, like, or at least the poor so would just stop working. So what would be your answer towards that?
Well, one part of the answer is that you don't have a poverty trap if you gave basic income. In other words, people would not be penalized if they took a low-wage job or a small-scale craft or whatever it would be, and tried to increase their income. So that poverty trap issue is an important part of the answer. But we have found in pilots across the world in different types of economy, India, in Africa, in Finland, in Canada, in Britain, wherever pilots have been done, a basic income results in people doing more work, not less, and being more productive when they do work and be more cooperative, more energized. And the reason is that we want to improve our living. Every human being, except for a tiny number of people, want to improve their living standards for their children, for their loved ones, for themselves, for their communities. And actually, a basic income gives people a sense of security in which to be entrepreneurial in a good sense, in a sense of wanting to experiment, wanting to take risks, wanting to do training, but because they can afford to do these things, wanting to dress better, or whatever it might be, in order to be able to participate in society to a greater extent. It is a complete prejudice that of people to say, if people had a basic income, they would stop working. It's pure prejudice. And when surveys have asked people, if you had a basic income, would you stop working? 95% or more people say, no, of course not. But others might, others, but not themselves. Well, others tend to be like ourselves. We should realize that. And in my view, the evidence and the theory is that if you had a basic income, you would do more of the type of work that you would like to do. I would like to spend more time caring for people. I would like to spend more time producing vegetables and fruit that are outside the market. I would like to spend more time learning and educating myself and my family. These are all forms of work that are discouraged if people are chronically insecure economically. And the type of work that we want to encourage in this impending ecological disaster, global warming and the disappearance of the species, we want people to spend more time in commoning in the sort of activities that revive nature and that respect nature, rather than in jobs, which are just often totally useless and alienating.
So you think that implementing a universal basic income could help in solving the climate change crisis?
Certainly, I believe strongly that a basic income is a necessary instrument in resolving the ecological crisis. We need to slow down. We need to de-emphasize GDP growth. We need to give value to unpaid care. We need to give value to people who spend their time renovating forests, renovating the sea, renovating swamps, or whatever. We want to give encouragement to activities of sharing, of non-market activities that are close to nature and respect nature. We certainly don't want to continue with an economy which is besotted by GDP, gross domestic product, where guns are equal to butter and where we're focusing entirely on market transactions and capitalistic growth. This is a road to disaster. And if we don't learn that very, very quickly, that disaster will hit our children and grandchildren and make life. People would slow down, do more care. What is what we want out of life? Surely that is what we want. And therefore, for me, it is part of the answer to the ecological crisis.
I think for a lot of people, the problem with UBI is that they think that a lot of the people would take that money and spend it on drugs, on tobacco, and alcohol. What's your opinion about that? Is that like a real fear?
The question of drugs and smoking and alcoholism, many other private bads are societal problems, and they stem from a lack of education, economic insecurity, poverty, many causes. You cannot expect basic income to solve all social problems. But I will tell you that people who have basic security in life tend to be able to avoid drugs, avoid bads. And we have found in our pilots with basic income that actually when people have basic incomes, their consumption of alcohol and drugs goes down. And the World Bank has also found that this is the case. So that it's a question of realizing that drugs have many social reasons, and most of those are bad. And the biggest cause of drug addiction and alcoholism is poverty. And a basic income would help give people an opportunity. We found in India that the men were stopping drinking so much alcohol. And we asked the women, and they said that's because now with their basic incomes, they're able to do more forms of work, and they're spending more of their time growing crops, growing whatever they were doing, and were actually spending less time sitting around doing nothing except drinking and smoking. So it's a complex issue, but there is certainly no evidence that if people have basic income, that they would increase their consumption of alcohol, drugs, or whatever. It is another prejudice that critics have said, but there's no evidence to support that.
So I'll conclude the arguments which are often used against UBI was like probably is right now the most important one, or the most difficult one, and especially that we had in the time of the COVID crisis a lot of cash assistance, and a lot of people blame the current inflation on that. So what is your opinion about that? Would a universal basic income cause inflation that could even like neutralize its impact?
Well, there are 2 points you've just made there. One is that during COVID, there was a lot of money suddenly available for governments to spend on support systems. Almost every government used the money in bad ways, giving more money to higher income groups than to lower income groups, administratively expensive systems they set up, and so on. But what was very clear during COVID is that an enormous number of people around the world came to realize that something like a basic income would be justifiable in helping people deal with shocks, dealing with unexpected setbacks, and enabling them to gain some form of control of their lives. So for me, the COVID experience is another one where a basic income system would have been a great help and would have saved many lives, I believe. But then your question about inflation. This is what, I'm an economist, and this is what we call one handle of a pair of scissors, one blade of a pair of scissors. Because if you give people a basic income, that increases their capacity to demand goods and services that they need. That by itself might increase inflationary pressure. But that's very bad economics because it also tends to increase the supply of goods and services. Because if there is an assurance of demand out there, people will start investing, saving, and producing more. And in producing more, they may gain economies of scale. In other words, the costs of production go down as they increase output. And what we found in our pilots in India, for example, is that at the end of the pilot, where we've been providing everybody in those communities with a basic income, inflation had gone down. The prices of food and services had gone down. And the reason was that farmers and others had a greater assurance of a market for their produce, and therefore they invested in seeds and fertilizers and set up shops and created more supply. So that the inflationary effect was completely contradicted. Prices went down. And that's because in an economic system, you've got to realize how the feedback effects take place, how investment follows from demand, and how more output lowers prices. So, and very fortunately, by a basic income system, you are encouraging demand for local goods and services, not imported luxuries that the wealthy go for. You provide everybody who needs the money most, and they spend it locally on local goods and services, which generates more output and more economic dynamism in the communities. So the inflationary effect is not real. And in fact, it has economically beneficial effects.
So now I guess we have answered the most important arguments against UBI. Before we go to the concluding questions, like I wanted to ask you, we live now in a time of, they call it poly crisis, because of multiple crises happening at the same time, and everybody is around the world is overwhelmed between the rise of AI, climate change, Ukraine instability, rising inequality. So you think that a universal basic income could be like an important factor in solving those crises, or like helping the people in resisting those crises?
Well, I'm glad you have made this the final big question, because we are living in the age of uncertainty, of chronic economic and social and natural uncertainty. And it's fundamentally different from the middle decades of the last century, which was a time of the development of welfare states in OECD countries, and a developmental model where it was expected that countries like Egypt and elsewhere would gradually develop a welfare state, an ILO model of social security. Those were designed to respond to what we call contingency risks: the risk of unemployment, the risk of an accident, the risk of an illness, the risk of becoming pregnant, the risk of getting old. These were risks that you could develop a social insurance system. You could work out the probabilities, you could work out how much the cost of a setback would be. We're no longer in that age. We're in an age where shocks can hit any of us, all of us. We've got pandemics. We've already had 6 pandemics this century. We have a situation where people do not know how vulnerable they are, but we feel vulnerable. We feel that something could happen bad, that it would hit any of us. And we do not know of the costs of those shocks or have any idea if we will be able to recover from those shocks, be they natural disasters, be they social, or be they medical. In that circumstance, we should realize that we need what we call ex ante protection, not ex post compensation. Ex ante means we provide people with that sense of resilience before any shock hits them. They know that whatever the shock, they will still have their basic income. And this is an essential part to make stress go down, make medical dilemmas go down, and people's behavior change to be more rational and longer term in their perspectives. So we are in a different age where globally, you and I and everybody listening could be hit by a shock at any stage. And we need a system which gives you a sense of protection, which you know is there. You know is there. And this sense comes with a basic income. It doesn't come from a welfare type system, which is means tested and behavior tested and conditional and ad hoc. You need a solid rock, and that solid rock is a basic income.
So after we have discussed the economic dimensions of an UBI, like there is the big question, obviously. And the big question is, as there have been so many pilot programs, if we know all the benefits of UBI, if you know all of that, like if that isn't a secret and research has shown that again and again, why isn't there an UBI in any country right now in the year of 2023? I mean, UBI is an old idea.
Well, there's always resistance to progressive ideas. I believe that we are meeting the final amount of resistance. As we speak, there are over 100 basic income pilots underway around the world. We have majority support in opinion polls for basic income. The remaining challenge is political. And we have to realize that we will only get a basic income if enough of us demand it, enough of us say we need it, enough of us can show that it will have beneficial effects. I believe that we're very close to a situation where basic income. And remember this, that before every progressive idea takes place, there is a huge cry that's impossible, it's never been done before, and it wouldn't work. It was the same with, for example, the National Health Service in Britain. Before 1948, huge numbers of people said, impossible, can never happen. It will be disastrous. And after that, once it's essential, it's fantastic. So we realize that every progressive idea goes through a phase of people saying it's impossible, it's never been done before. And then it's done. And that is the same, I believe, with a basic income. I cannot believe that humanity is stupid enough to think that we do not want everybody to have basic security. That's what I want. That's what we should all want. And I believe that it will come. I believe that within the next 5 years, now we realize the neoliberal economics has failed, rentier capitalism has failed. We're on the real risk of world collapse, and the old models are not working. And therefore, the more and more people are open to a transformational, progressive idea, and that's basic income. And I believe that with automation, disruptive effects of inequalities and insecurities, that we have a unique opportunity now to make sure that basic income is part of the progressive politics over the next decade.
Thank you very much. I think those were like perfect concluding remarks. Thank you very much for your time.
Yep.
And for being the guest of our first episode.
Okay, good.
And I hope to have you again.
Well, I wish you success in every episode.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good. It's great.